Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, and I'm director of the Lloyd Library and Museum. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Between Art and Life in the Second Millennium BC, the unusual tale of the Aegean Argonaut. The Lloyd Library was founded more than 140 years ago by three brothers who manufactured nature-based drugs. To support their research, they collected books and specimens from around the world, going back hundreds of years. As a result, the Lloyd Library collection demonstrates the intersection of art, history, and science. Tonight's program goes back thousands of years as we explore the depiction of marine life in the art of the late Bronze Age. Our presenter, Dr. Emily Catherine Egan, is Assistant Professor of Ancient Eastern Mediterranean Art and Archaeology at the University of Maryland. She's conducted research, archaeological fieldwork in Italy, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Jordan, Armenia. Her research focuses on painted surface decorations and especially on the images and symbols of ancient Greek wall and floor paintings. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Catherine Egan.
Hi, Patricia. Can you hear
me?
I am just delighted to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Just put this up as I get started. So again, thank you so much for inviting me this evening. I'm delighted to be here and to get the chance to share some of my research with you. I'll note that I spent 10 years in Cincinnati while I was writing my dissertation, doing my graduate work. And so this is extra special for me for that reason. I'll make two quick disclaimers. First, I just realized the chair I'm sitting in is very squeaky, so I apologize. I will try to keep my movements to a minimum. And second, I do have a young 3-year-old daughter in the room next door, so I hope that she will be going to bed soon, but you may hear her in the background, so just don't be alarmed if there's some chatter. Okay. The art of Bronze Age Greece, circa 3000 to 1100 BC, abounds with marine motifs. Among the best known are dolphins and octopuses, which, together with fish, urchins, anemones, cockles, triton shells, and argonauts, can be found on a wide range of artistic media. To varying degrees, each member of this aquatic coterie has been a subject of scholarly scrutiny. My own contributions in recent years have focused on the Argonaut. This evening, I will take a closer look at this remarkable animal and share with you some of my conclusions, some old and some new, which center on its depictions in the wall paintings of the Mycenaean Palace of Nestor at Pylos. The Palace of Nestor is located in the southwestern corner of the Greek Peloponnese, in the region of Messenia, about 6 kilometers inland on the modern hill of Apano-Englianos. Composed of 4 architectural units, the palace in its final form was in use from roughly 1300 to 1200 BC. It was excavated between 1939 and 1964 under the direction of Carl W. Blagan, professor of classics at the University of Cincinnati. At Pylos, Blagan and his colleagues unearthed a veritable treasure trove, architectural foundations uniquely unobscured by later constructions, the first archive of Linear B tablets to be discovered on the Greek mainland, and, for our purposes this evening, the remains of an elaborate decorative program that included more than 17,000 fragments of lime plaster murals. In 1969, a selection of these murals was published by a most unlikely author, Bryn Mawr Professor of Classical Greek Language and Literature, Mabel Louise Lang, who never attempted to hide the fact that she was a novice in the field of fresco studies. The foreword to her volume, the second in the site's final monograph, opens with the following paragraph. When Professor Blagan first invited me to the Pylos excavations to clean frescoes in 1957, neither of us expected that the cleaning, sorting, and joining would continue for 7 seasons, with 3 additional summers devoted more particularly to study and photography. Thereafter, it would have been desirable from many points of view for the publication of the frescoes to be undertaken by a historian of art, steeped in the painting of the period and recognized for his judgment and knowledge therein. In the apparent absence of such a person, it seemed possible that intimate association with the Pylos fragments in their thousands might substitute for wider learning, and that the freshness of an untutored and unprejudiced eye might stand in lieu of practiced judgment. And so it has come to pass that this new material, which is of great importance for the whole study of Mycenaean painting, is presented by one whose work has been primarily in history and epigraphy, albeit always with a leaning toward puzzles. Despite her lack of formal training, Lang produced what remains one of the most thorough and attentive accounts of a fresco corpus unearthed anywhere in the Aegean world. In the case of the Argonaut paintings, she offered careful descriptions of 6 examples, 2 of which, shown here at top and in the lower right, were reconstructed by renowned archaeological draftsman Ph.D., pictured in the lower left. Of the total group, Lang concluded that the Pylian Argonauts were exceptional. Painted Argonauts from other sites, she wrote, have nothing in common with these tidy little cephalopods, which instead appear to have taken their form from the earlier use of gold and ivory examples strung out in jewelry and inlay. As for function, Lang viewed the animals as strictly ornamental, pleasing to look at, but with no semantic value. This evening, I will revisit this theory and present some evidence to the contrary, highlighting both the probable symbolisms of the Pylian Argonauts, as well as their ability to shed light on the muralists who produced them. But before we get to the art, I want to offer a brief introduction to the living animal. The Mediterranean Argonaut, Argonaut argo, is a pelagic cephalopod of the order Octopoda. Anatomically, it shares many features with the common octopus, Octopus vulgaris, including 8 arms and chromatophores, sophisticated cells that allow its skin to change color. It is distinguished by its open sea habitat, its extreme sexual dimorphism, and, in the case of females, its possession of 2 webbed dorsal arms and its association with a paper-thin, boat-shaped shell that serves as both a temporary housing for the animal and also as a brood case. Known in classical antiquity as the nautilus, Greek for sailor, the animal received its modern classification in 1758 from Linnaeus, who chose the name Argonaut to maintain the creature's ancient association with seafaring. In Greco-Roman literature, such associations date back to the 4th century BC, when Aristotle made the following observations in his Historia Animalium. The nautilus, Argonaut, is a polyp, but unusual in both its nature and behavior, for it sails upon the sea after it has made an ascent up from the depths. It ascends with its shell turned down so that it may more easily rise and navigate in an empty shell, and when it has reached the surface, it turns the shell around. Between its arms, it has a kind of web, such as web-footed animals have between their toes, except that for the web-footed ones, it is thick, while for the nautilus, it is thin like a cobweb. It uses the web when a breeze is blowing as a sail and lets down some of its arms as rudders. If it is frightened, it fills its shell with water and sinks under the sea. This same idea, illustrated in the etching on the left, was echoed in an early 3rd century BC epigram of Callimachus and repeated with nearly identical language in the first 3 centuries CE in the scientific writings of Pliny the Elder, Oppian, Athenaeus, and Aegean. In the 19th century, such behavior was recorded in diaries kept by early travelers to Greece, including the artist Edward Dodwell, and was even incorporated into Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. In the latter story, Captain Nemo's ship, the Nautilus, while voyaging in the Indian Ocean, is surrounded by a fleet of Argonauts sailing upon the water's surface. It was also in the 19th century that the Argonaut and its purported sailing behavior came under new scientific scrutiny. Among the first individuals to take a deep interest in the animal was self-taught naturalist Jeanne Villepreux-Power. Originally a seamstress from the French town of Gieques, Villepreux-Power in 1816 moved with her husband to Sicily, where she engaged in intensive studies of the island's marine life, with an emphasis on the Argonaut. Her main objective was to resolve an outstanding question about the animal's shell, which other naturalists had argued the octopod poached in the manner of a hermit crab. To assess this hypothesis, Villepreux-Power designed and built some of the world's first scientific aquaria and underwater observation cages, in which she could view live specimens. As a result of nearly a decade of research, she established that the Argonaut, the female specifically, grew the shell itself, generating it from a young age using its dorsal webs. In 1837, her conclusions were verified by the French malacologist Captain Sander Rang, who, while stationed in Algiers, also made a special study of the animal's motor habits, which, he noted, did not include sailing. Today, Rang's assertion that the sailing behavior described by Aristotle is altogether fictitious remains valid. Indeed, the only reason that the Argonaut regularly comes to the sea's surface is to collect air in its shell. This practice, identified by leading Argonaut researcher Julian Finn, senior curator of marine invertebrates at the Museum Victoria in Melbourne, is practical, done to allow the animal, once it descends into the water column, to achieve the neutral buoyancy that it needs to swim around. As illustrated in the diagram shown here on the left, the animal rises to the surface, rocks back and forth to capture a suitable quantity of air, seals the air off in the deepest part of its shell with one of its dorsal webs, then resubmerges to swim, always with the aperture of its shell oriented to the side or facing upward. With this information in mind, let us now return to the Bronze Age motif. In Greece, the Argonaut as a decorative element first appears in Cretan vase painting. Among the earliest known examples is that shown here on an amphora from the palace at Phaistos. The vase dates to the Middle Bronze Age, to the late 18th century BC, falling within the period known as the Middle Minoan or MM2B. As depicted, the motif is an example of the classical Camara style, featuring a pictorialized rather than truly pictorial motif in red and white paint on a dark slipped ground. It is in the late Bronze Age, however, that the motif first achieves popularity on Crete, appearing in the late 16th and early 15th centuries, during the period known as Late Minoan or LM1B, as a central feature of the so-called marine style. In appearance, the marine style Argonaut has a number of standard characteristics. The animal's shell is rendered with the aperture facing downward and is infilled with wavy striations. Along the shell's keel is a row of small bumps, tubercles, and at its base is an empty zone, likely meant to indicate the opening. From an imagined space between the pointed front of the aperture and the curled swell of the keel's shell emerge 3 out or upstretched arms, terminating in forward-facing curls and each ornamented on the underside with a single row of suckers. In terms of environment, marine-style Argonauts, like marine-style octopuses, anemones, urchins, and tritons, are routinely shown in their natural underwater habitat, indicated here by a dense scale pattern. After destructions on Crete at the end of Late Minoan 1B, the Argonaut motif continues to appear on pottery, but in a more abstracted form. In the late 15th century, in Late Minoan 2, the shell of the animal is often converted into a heart-like shape akin to an ivy leaf, while the curled tips of the arms are wound in the manner of spirals and often enclose ornamental dots or rosettes. Many of the examples appear on so-called Ephyrean goblets, one of which is shown here. Concurrently, in the 15th and later in the 14th and 13th centuries BC, the Argonaut motif also extends to 2 new Cretan media, frescoes and clay coffins, called larnaces. In Cretan frescoes, shown here, the Argonaut has a singular appearance at Knossos, where Sir Arthur Evans unearthed fragments of the curled arms of a large-scale example dating either to Late Minoan 2 or 3A. The animal shown here is reconstructed by the Swiss artist Émile Gillon-Fils and published by Evans in his magnum opus, The Palace of Minos, is painted in hues of yellow, blue, white, and black, and appears against an undulating background populated by slender blue reeds. Similar riparian, that is riverside flora, appear alongside the Argonaut on Late Minoan 3 larnaces, 3 of which are shown here from the cemeteries at Kavr-Hori and Armeni. In these examples and others, the Argonaut is accompanied by papyrus plants, reeds, and palm trees, as well as aquatic birds and deer. These plants and animals, minus the Argonaut, are known in other riparian depictions, most famously in an earlier 16th century BC fresco from the West House at Akrotiri. The depicted scene has its roots in Egypt, reminiscent of scenes of fowling along the Nile marshlands found in tombs. As argued by Livia Morgan in the Theron fresco, which comes from an elite dwelling, the human elements that characterize the Egyptian scenes have been removed and replaced by new, explicitly Aegean animal pairings. In this case, the motif of a griffin hunting a deer, which has been added to echo the traditional Egyptian motif of a cat hunting a bird. In 1991, Vance Watrous argued that Argonauts on Cretan larnacies were meant to represent the sea that separated the land of the living from the afterworld, itself represented by the riparian elements, plants and birds, which Watrous contended were borrowed from contemporary Egyptian iconography of the paradise of the dead, known as the Field of Reeds, or Ar-Aru. Such riverine elements, he further suggested, indicated that deer hunts and other activities on the Cretan larnacies were meant to be understood as taking place in the afterlife. Such readings are compelling, but it remains odd that the Argonaut should be so directly incorporated into these riparian scenes. Octopuses, for example, which also make an appearance on larnacies and which also are thought to represent the crossed sea, are usually displayed in separate panels, permitting them to maintain the integrity of their marine identity. Given this evidence, I have suggested that the Argonaut did not stand for the crossed sea, but rather signified the crossing itself. In other words, the animal was not perceived as something one passed over on the way to the afterlife, but rather the means of conveyance by which one got there. On the Cretan larnacies, such a reading is facilitated by the Argonaut's posture, which suggests forward movement, as well as by its direct association with the riparian land of the dead, in which it appears to have arrived, or to use a nautical term, docked. Notably, this reading also helps explain Aristotle's scientifically inaccurate account of the animal's sailing behavior, suggesting that he based his description not on direct observation, but on an idea born nearly 1,000 years earlier in the Bronze Age. Putting aside for the moment questions of meaning, the formal evolution of the pot-painted Argonaut motif on Crete is one that was also echoed in the late Bronze Age Greek mainland. In the late 15th century, during the phase known as Late Helladic or LH2A, the Argonaut appears on vessels in a close imitation of the contemporary LM1B marine style. In LH2 and LH3, the mainland Argonaut, like its contemporary counterpart on Crete, becomes increasingly stylized, with additional arm coils and its body occasionally assuming the form of a papyrus umbel rather than an ivy leaf. Another nod, I would suggest, to the riparian connections spelled out more explicitly on the Cretan larnacies. On other vessels, the body of the Argonaut is entirely eliminated, leaving behind only a swirl of arms adjoined at one end. Alongside pottery, the Argonaut also makes an appearance on the mainland in metalwork, most famously on two objects. The earlier 16th century bronze dagger from Pylos II at Rutsi depicts on both sides of its blade, which is shown here, a row of 5 Argonauts of descending size, separated by outcrops of marine rockwork. Each animal has a silver or gold striated shell and 3 curled arms with suckers reaching outward to form a vertical stack. The second object, a 15th century gold repoussé cup from the Royal Tholos at Dendra, depicts 10 Argonauts in a narrow field just below its rim. Set against a scale pattern, the animals are organized in 2 schools, highlighted here, above 2 octopuses, with 1 solo animal, now highlighted, framed by a pair of down-diving dolphins. In comparison to the Rutsi examples, the postures of the Dendra Argonauts appear somewhat stiff, with their arms raised upward in small, tight curls. The source of such stylization, Jeffrey Hurwitz has proposed, may be in the goldsmith's imitation of Argonaut motifs as depicted in contemporary glass paste and ivory inlay. A selection of such ornaments, shown here in jewelry, the same as referenced by Lang in her assessment of the Pelian paintings, as found in chamber tombs in both the mainland, are shown here. As is evident in these examples, some Argonauts are shown singly, while others show a double version of the animal, reflected about a central axis. As noted already by Evans in his 1906 study of the prehistoric tombs at Knossos, such double animals are something of an optical illusion, having the appearance of octopuses with outstretched arms, 2 large eyes, and a striated mantle. This effect is strongest when the double animals, usually depicted on gold and glass beads, are viewed vertically, as illustrated by a gold bead, now highlighted in the upper left, from Tholos 7, recently discovered at Pylos by University of Cincinnati archaeologists Jack Davis and Sherry Stalker. It should be remembered, however, that such beads were perforated to be strung horizontally, emphasizing a symmetry that is top to bottom rather than side to side. While octopods are still apparent in this arrangement, it also invites additional readings, such as a boat reflected in the water, or perhaps the twinned worlds of the living and the dead, between which the Argonaut was believed to travel. Having offered some thoughts about Argonauts in three-dimensional media, I will now turn to the promised core of my talk, discussion of the Argonauts in Pylian wall paintings, which I have been studying since 2006. As noted earlier, 6 Argonaut paintings were published by Lang in 1969 as part of her study of the frescoes at the Palace of Nestor. These paintings, dating to the 13th century BC, were excavated in those areas highlighted in blue in the palace plan shown in the lower left, namely palace rooms 2, 16, and 20, and 2 plaster dumps located to the northwest and southwest of the site. Each animal cataloged by Lang possessed similar features. As illustrated by the annotated watercolor in the lower left, these include 3 upraised curled arms, large eyes with prominent pupils, shells with wavy striations and scalloped keels, and a protruding funnel. In 5 cases, the shells were monochrome hues of yellow, blue, red, or purple, while in 1 case, now highlighted, the animal had a 2-toned shell of blue and yellow. Also unlike its compatriots, this Argonaut moved to the right, mimicking the direction of another highly abraded Argonaut, discussed by Lang but not cataloged or photographed, to which I shall return shortly. As mentioned earlier, Lang viewed the form and linear arrangement of these animals as inspired by depictions in older jewelry and inlay. Lines of Argonauts in a necklace or on a footstool, she argued, were the inspiration for lines of Argonauts in Pylian wall painting, where they served as borders for figural scenes. Clear evidence for this use is indicated by a group of fragments, now highlighted in the lower right, in which the cephalopods can be seen to inhabit a narrow band directly below a larger frieze containing at least 2 white horses, recognizable by their striated hooves and fetlocks. Based on this evidence, Lang surmised that all the Argonaut bands at Pylos belonged to such borders and were used to frame friezes with genre scenes like grazing animals, the horses, as well as shrine facades and gossiping ladies, all of which were found in association with Argonaut fragments. These motifs Lang viewed as analogous to decorative elements in modern wallpaper and referred to the unit formed by them and their Argonaut borders as Nautilus wallpaper friezes. Their function, she contended, was purely ornamental. Today, more than 50 years after Lang's publication, it is now possible to say more about these Pylian Argonauts, largely as a result of the identification of new examples within the fresco material saved from Blagan's excavations. In total, 53 new paintings of Argonauts have been identified by myself, Heraclea Brekulaki, and other members of the Hora Apotheki Reorganization Project, or HARP, directed by Sherry Stalker. The fragments bearing these animals, published preliminarily by myself and Brekulaki in 2015, were excavated in the areas here highlighted in red, which include both rooms in the palace and a large plaster dump on the slope to its northwest. Despite often considerable damage, all of the new examples preserve physical features identified by Lang, and in 44 cases appear to be arranged in narrow bands. 2 new schemes, however, have also been observed. The first scheme is what I call Argonaut rendered on a large scale. 2 such animals have been identified, one composed of fragments from room 6 and room 19, and one from fragments from the northwest slope dump. The first fragment group, shown here, Lang cataloged as part of a pattern representing either part of a stone dado, a flounced drapery, or a griffin's wing. Instead, the bands of blue, white, and dark yellow have now been reconstructed as 3 Argonaut arms, stacked one on top of the other, and ornamented with 3 lines of front-facing suckers, rendered as black outlined ovals with white centers. The red triangular spikes along the outer edge of the blue arm represent a 4th row of suckers rendered in profile, similar to those appearing on the arms of the mural Argonaut from Knossos. The second large-scale Argonaut comprises 4 fragments not published by Lang, each of which features stacked bands of blue, white, red, and/or yellow, with central ovals that can again be reconstructed as suckered arms. What makes these fragments unusual is the proliferation of colored bands, numbering up to 5 on a single fragment. This indicates that each of the animal's arms was bichrome, as shown in this preliminary reconstruction. A design choice also evident on another 13th century BC large-scale wall-painted Argonaut from the Mycenaean site of Gla, published by Spiros Iacovidis and recently re-examined by Christos Boulotis. The second new scheme is Argonaut as ship decoration. Again, 2 examples have been identified, both from Pylos Hall 64, highlighted here on the right. The first example includes the fragment, shown on the left, which Lang assigned to a narrow border band high on the room's northeast wall, as shown in this reconstruction by Mike Nelson. These same Argonauts, however, are now understood to have been ornamentation on the hull of a ship, my own reconstruction of which is shown here, the form of which matches that of ships previously recognized and published by the HARP team as part of the Hall 64 naval scene, now shown below as reconstructed by Rosemary Robertson. The second group, represented by the fragments shown in the upper left, likely represent a second ship with Argonaut decoration. In this small group, parts of 2 purple and dark yellow shells and bodies are preserved, both facing right, against a white ground crossed by a dark yellow sawtooth band. The lower edge of the band, which I've reconstructed as the lower edge of a ship's hull, rests above a purple ground, which, on analogy with the naval scene, should represent the sea. Collectively, these discoveries have served as catalysts for the ongoing reinvestigation of the Argonaut motif at the Palace of Nestor. The sheer number of examples alone is striking. In addition to the single example from Gla, already mentioned, only 5 other painted plaster compositions with Argonauts are known from the Bronze Age Greek mainland. 3 of these come from Mycenae, one on the wind screen of a ship's cabin, shown on the right, one on a plastered step from the palace, shown on the left, and one in an unpublished marine frieze from Petz's house, which I am currently reconstructing. 2 additional scenes come from Tiryns, one on a fragment group recovered from the western staircase, now shown in the lower left, and one reported as painted on the floor of the palace's throne room. The identification of the wall-painted animal, which appears to be grasping the handle of a bronze vessel in one of its curled arms, is still speculative. At Pylos, by contrast, the creature seems almost ubiquitous, and based on its fine contexts, appears to have decorated rooms of the palace during both earlier and later parts of the 13th century. Indeed, the Argonaut is so prominent at Bronze Age Pylos that Brekulaki and I have suggested it might even be understood as a royal totem, much like the griffin, which was assigned this role by Blagan and Rawson, and which today emblazons the town hall of modern Pylos. More specific evidence for the Argonaut's significance comes from its depictions in Hall 64. As hull decoration, the Argonauts in this room are directly associated not just with the sea, but with seafaring. On its own, this association corroborates my earlier suggestion that the animal was perceived as a little sailor in the Bronze Age. It also suggests that Argonauts may have served as emblems of naval power, akin to emblems that have been identified on the hulls of ships in a famous miniature fresco from Akrotiri. The hulls of these vessels are decorated with animals including lions, birds, and dolphins, which have been identified by nanomarinatos as evoking either qualities of the ship's occupants or the spheres of influence, land, sky, and sea, over which the larger population exercised control. Turning to the large-scale Pylian Argonauts, while the original location of the first animal or one of the animals cannot be reconstructed with certainty, there's a good chance that the other can be restored to the southwest wall of room 6, the palace throne room. In this room, the Argonaut finds itself in the company of other large-scale animals, including at least one lion and griffin on the room's northeast wall, as shown in this reconstruction. Frequently reconstructed as part of a pair, these animals have been interpreted as protective and also symbolic, referencing the divine power of the Mycenaean monarchs or king who sat on the throne. In a parallel capacity, a large Argonaut could have represented the naval power of the leader, providing a visual link to the ships in Hall 64 and perhaps to the large octopus, another marine emblem, painted on the floor in front of the throne. Indeed, if the Argonaut was positioned centrally on the throne room's southwest wall, it, like the octopus, would have been in line with the throne, intensifying the motif's visual link to the Wanox and his naval enterprise. It is also possible, however, that the animal was meant to be associated not with the griffin, the lion, or the octopus, but with a fourth large-scale animal, a deer, found in rune 17 and also assigned tentatively by Lang to the throne room's southwest wall. As shown in the de Young watercolor appearing in the lower left, the cervid is represented by its hindquarters, behind which is the thick, leafy stalk of what Lang identified as a papyrus reed hybrid. If this association between the Argonaut and deer is correct, the resulting scene would seem to be another example of the cephalopod in a riparian environment, one comparable to that apparent on the Cretan Larnaces, and one suggesting that the function of the Pylos throne room may have been somehow linked to the cult of the dead. Finally, we return to the remaining 44 paintings of Pylian Argonauts, arranged in single-filed narrow bands. As I remarked earlier, it was this arrangement that caused Lang to relegate the motif to decorative status. Now that the corpus has been expanded to include examples of the animal in different formats and with apparent symbolisms, Brekulaki and I have judged it necessary to revisit this claim. It is possible, for example, that long chains of identical Argonauts were emblematic. As discussed by Maria Shaw, why the reduplication of isolated motifs in Aegean paintings is often done to exploit the motif's decorative potential, in some cases it has the opposite effect and enhances their symbolic power. To take a classic example, figure 8 shields, shown here, which are part of the Mycenaean military kit, Shaw argues, become concentrated symbols of power when extracted from narratives and arrayed in friezes in impressive numbers, such as seen in this wall painting from Tiryns. At Pylos, the lines of repeating Argonauts may have functioned similarly, serving as a pars pro toto distillations of the power associated with the naval strength or the dead, communicated by the contextualized cephalopods in Hall 64 and the throne room. Collectively, these conclusions provide us with new ways of thinking about the Pylian Argonaut, not as a decorative ornament, but as a potent symbol. This is, however, but one aspect of these animals, namely their intended meaning. As works of art, they are also forms of expression, and it is on this subject that I would like to end my talk, taking us back to our initial discussion of the live animal. To do this, let us take one last look at Lang's tidy examples. As I mentioned earlier, the Argonauts in rows, old and new, show remarkable standardization in their overall appearance. A closer look, however, reveals minor variations within the corpus. Such variations are present in selected anatomical details. Keels are rendered as 1, 2, or 3 scalloped lines with crenellations indicated as points or small loops. Suckers are depicted as dots, U-shaped crescents, triangles, or not at all. Funnels are hollow or filled with a single line, loop, or a series of fine diagonal lines. And eyes are drawn both with and without eyelashes. Optically, these variations are rather insignificant. After all, they are small details on already small motifs, which in all likelihood were designed to be digested quickly by viewers. One need only glance at the Argonaut bands to gain a satisfactory impression of their content. From a production standpoint, however, these same minor variations are more interesting, raising questions about why they exist. The answer, I believe, can be found in the field of attribution studies, which have demonstrated that subsidiary details in art are usually the result of different artists' working habits. Attribution studies began in the late 19th century with the work of art historian and physician Giovanni Morelli, who examined subsidiary elements like ears in Renaissance paintings as a way to detect unconscious, personalized modes of artistic representation. In the 20th century, Morelli's technique was famously adopted for the study of Greek painting by Sir John Beazley, who used it to identify the unnamed hands responsible for the decoration of attic vases. In the 1970s and 1980s, such Morellian analysis was first applied to Bronze Age murals, with pioneering work done by Mark Cameron at Knossos and Mary Hollinshead and Ellen Davis at Akrotiri. Working from the premise that minor details stem from individual working habits, it is likely that the small variations between the Pylian Argonauts are the result of the modi operandi of different muralists, all of whom, it would seem, were allowed to personalize their work. Such freedom, to my mind, is interesting. Indeed, in the case of all Argonauts represented in Aegean Bronze Age art, not just those at Pylos, artistic freedom is readily apparent in the animal's basic physical form. Even in Cretan marine-style pottery, often cited as sporting more naturalistic representations of aquatic fauna, it is clear that the Argonauts' depictions are not, in fact, true to life. In such renderings, exemplified by the rhyton, shown here on the left, which I showed earlier, the animals are shown in motion with their shell apertures facing downward instead of up or to the side, and in possession of only 3 rather than 8 arms. The latter detail, Isabel Bradford has suggested, may be an attempt to render in profile the 3 pairs of the animal's normal-looking arms, omitting the 2 unsightly webbed appendages. The erroneous swimming posture, it has been argued, may derive from ancient artists' failure to observe the living animal in motion, relying instead on dead beach cast specimens, the posture and movement of which artists reconstructed based on the morphology and motor habits of land snails. In wall paintings, the use of bold colors in the Argonauts' arms and shells, while possibly related to color changes affected by the animal's chromatophores, might also be construed as fanciful, intended to produce a visual rhythm similar to that apparent in other examples of Mycenaean painting, for example, the shields from Tiryns that we looked at earlier. While the shared fictitious features of all Argonauts in Aegean art speak to one kind of artistic freedom, differences in the rendering of minor details at Pylos speak to another. Indeed, these details, which vary across depictions, could imply that at Pylos, the painting process actively involved its muralists as designers, affording them input in an environment that lacked micromanagement by the palace. A general lack of palatial oversight can be inferred from Mycenaean texts, which, at Pylos and elsewhere, are silent on the subject of wall painting. A scenario might be imagined in which Pylian artists were told by their patrons simply to paint a row of Argonauts, and in doing so, they instinctively or unconsciously combined standardized elements, seen, if not on heirloom jewelry, perhaps in pattern books, with personalized flourishes to produce an array of individualized results. Regardless of how much or how little instruction artists were accorded, the resulting paintings tell us something about what really mattered in a Pylian Argonaut. Some features, like the patterning of the shell, the number of arms, the presence of an eye, it seemed, were essential and therefore possessed fixed forms. By contrast, details like suckers, keel and funnel lines, and eyelashes were non-essential and therefore flexible in their inclusion and/or appearance. In other words, some aspects of Argonaut depiction were negotiable and some were not. This simple conclusion is extremely important. Among other things, it forces us to think more carefully about composition in Mycenaean art. How, for example, are we to interpret the purpose of artistic freedoms, like those detected in the Pylian Argonauts? Was it practical, as a way to allow an artist to execute his brief more efficiently, as might be indicated by the cursory dot suckers? Or was it strategic, calculated to add visual interest across multiple repetitive compositions? Further, how are we to interpret artists' attitudes toward these freedoms? Are we to read each individualized flourish as a simple subconscious response, or as a highly personal assertion of artistic independence, skill, or even specialized knowledge? It's perhaps notable that some Argonaut variations, such as the double-lined keel, come closer to imitating reality than others. As I conclude this talk, I want to return to Mabel Lang and to emphasize again the importance of the foundations laid by her primary study of Apelian frescoes. Certainly in the case of the Argonaut, I propose some conflicting interpretations, and there are indeed many questions that remain to be answered. It is only because of Lang, however, that new work is even possible, and because of her that we can approach it with 8 good legs to stand on. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. That was beautiful and fascinating. Not showing on the screen. Are you seeing me?
I am seeing you.
Okay, all
Can you
right.
see me?
I can see you, so that's great. So yeah, that was really fascinating, and very, very beautiful. There's so many things that sort of sparked my curiosity when you talked.
Good.
One of the things was the idea that the inaccurate portrayal of the Argonaut might have been a failure because they did not observe them in motion. And I know that some of the early American naturalists like Mark Catesby took great pride in the fact that his renderings and depictions were all from live animals. And I think that, you know, you sort of reinforce that by showing, you know, how that might make things look and understand differently. I also really liked what you said about Aristotle, and that his ideas came not from, or his depictions and his descriptions came not from observation, but from ideas. And I think that's something, again, we see a lot in literature. We've got some books on display right now during the Mighty Deep from the 1600s, and it's almost from legend and magic that these animals are, and it's because they didn't really know what was deep down there. So their ideas and their imaginations shaped that. And then when they had the tools and the implements to really look at things more clearly. So again, very, very fascinated with that. I did have a quick question. I see there are some from our audience too. And one is that given the prevalence of the Argonauts, can we use that to, and having them as a symbol of naval power, possibly a royal totem, can we use that to suggest or understand anything about trade patterns or conquering people and that sort of thing?
That's an excellent question. First, also, thank you for drawing out those 2 points about sort of drawing from life and about Aristotle being reliant on ideas. I think these are both really important points, and they're kind of through lines in a lot of my research. And I think one of the big debates or great sort of conversations about Bronze Age art is the question about to what extent they drew from life. Because in some cases, they're very accurate, like surprisingly, sort of astonishingly accurate. And in some cases, they just absolutely depart. And the question becomes, is the departure intentional? Is this artistic license? Are they trying to improve on nature in some way? Or is it a failure because they haven't actually seen it? So this is a great question. About the Argonaut as kind of a totem, one of the ways that you could read into this is, for example, the great naval power that Homer presents Pylos as. So in the Odyssey, when they're kind of mustering ships, and in the Iliad, they talk about Pylos as having this impressive naval presence, second only to that of Agamemnon. And so that sort of idea also maybe makes its way later and might suggest that indeed Pylos was this great sort of naval power. We do have linear B tablets from the site that talk about its navy. Trade is a little bit harder. Strangely, Pylos is kind of bereft of what we'd call exotica. They don't seem to be importing things as aggressively as some of the Mycenaean palaces in the Argolids. So Mycenaean Tirans, which have these really deep relationships with the Levant and with Egypt, for example, we don't really see in play. at Pylos, but what we do see is a very close relationship between the site and Knossos. So that interaction, which does require seafaring between the island of Crete and the mainland, may be kind of part of the story. So it's not necessarily trade far and beyond, but something local that maybe lays the foundation for a lot of their local power. We see many iconographic themes being borrowed from Crete, and it's important, I think, that the only other place where we get an Argonaut in this riverine landscape in a wall painting is Knossos. So it's sort of Knossos and Pylos are having this conversation, which may speak to a larger sort of seafaring relationship.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Randy and Jan Johnson want to know, are there other animals present in similar numbers as the Argonauts?
There are not at Pylos, at least. We have, there are, oh, actually, I'll take that back. There are no other marine animals. The site has a surprisingly large number of felines depicted. So we have a land animal presence. We also do have quite a few griffins, which is why the original excavators were eager to make that kind of the totem of Pylos. But in terms of kind of sea creatures, whereas on Crete, for example, we have lots of octopuses and dolphins, we do see those on the mainland, but not so much at Pylos. Pylos seems to have selected the Argonaut as its marine emblem above the other options. But the conversation, I think, between kind of the land animals and the marine animals is really interesting. And I think that's why I like this comparison with the Cretan larnaces, the coffins, because it's the only other place you see them kind of in the same environment. Usually the marine things are in one place and the land things are in another. So there's something kind of fun going on with that interaction. So the numbers of land animals, the numbers of Argonauts might be relevant. Thank you for the question.
And I'll give a second to see if there are any more questions. I don't see any others that are coming through on the chat right this minute. So Emily, I want to thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation this morning or this evening. I can't even claim I'm in a different time zone this evening. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. And I want to remind everybody that programs like this are made possible in part by the members of the Lloyd Library. And to all of you, please watch for more programs. And for those that are here tonight, this will be on our YouTube channel. So you can watch it again, share it. And so have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.